The Drexel dynasty is a dual symphony of two starkly different warring Americas. For over a century, it was the absolute symbol of old money Philadelphia, a reserved, aristocratic, and deeply respected banking family founded in 1837 by Francis Martin Drexel. This first dynasty built its fortune by financing the U.S. government, funding the Industrial Revolution, and becoming the trusted chosen partner of the great J.P. Morgan. They were the picture of stability and conservative power. Then, in the late 20th century, that old money name was hijacked by a new force, aggressive, revolutionary, and ruthless. The firm, now Drexel Burnham Lambert, became the personal war machine of Michael Milken. Milken did not finance governments. He armed corporate raiders. His invention, the junk bond, created the modern market for high-risk corporate debt, fueling the leveraged buyout LBO craze of the 1980s and making Drexel the most powerful and feared bank on Wall Street. But this new empire was built on a toxic foundation, a criminal conspiracy. The Drexel story is a tale of two collapses. The first was a financial crisis in the 19th century, which the family survived. The second, in 1990, was a catastrophic self-destruction, an implosion of greed, insider trading, and racketeering led by Milken. It was a scandal so vast that it didn't just land the junk bond king in prison. It erased the 152-year-old firm overnight and became the ultimate symbol of an era of excess that would change Wall Street forever. The Drexel dynasty, unlike the old money Knickerbocker families of New York, was not born in America. It was the creation of a single, ambitious, and artistic immigrant, Francis Martin Drexel. Born in 1792 in the Austrian Tyrol, Francis was not a banker. He was a portrait painter. Fleeing the chaos and endless conscription of the Napoleonic Wars, he emigrated to the United States in 1817, settling in the dynamic, growing city of Philadelphia. For years, Francis Drexel lived the life of an itinerant artist, traveling through America and South America, painting portraits of wealthy merchants and landowners. But he was also, by nature, a pragmatist. He understood that his true talent was not just art, but commerce. As a German-speaking Austrian, he found himself a natural and trusted confidant for the waves of German and Austrian immigrants flooding into Philadelphia. They came with strange foreign currencies, thalers, gulden, and kreuzers, and they needed someone to exchange them for U.S. dollars. Drexel, with his European connections, began a small side business as a currency exchange broker. He quickly realized that there was far more profit in exchanging money than in painting portraits. In 1837, at the very moment the American economy was imploding in the financial panic of 1837, Francis Drexel made his move. While other banks were collapsing, he saw an opportunity. He founded Drexel and Company in Philadelphia. His timing was perfect. The panic had wiped out his weaker competitors, and he used his own capital, saved from his painting career, to establish himself as a fortress of stability. His business model was simple and safe. He was not a speculator. He was a service provider. He positioned his small bank as the primary, trusted agent for immigrants and merchants. He exchanged their foreign currency at a fee. He sold them gold bullion, which he sourced through his European connections. And he facilitated transatlantic notes, allowing an immigrant in Philadelphia to safely send money back to his family in Frankfurt or Vienna. He was, in effect, the Western Union of the Gilded Age, and his reputation for honesty and German prudence made him a massive success. He built his dynasty not on risky loans, but on high-volume, low-risk transaction fees. He was the muleteer's grandson of the Philadelphia banking scene, a man who, like Vespasian, understood that money doesn't stink, and that real, sustainable wealth came from taking a small, guaranteed cut of every transaction. This conservative, immigrant-focused model was the foundation of the family's old money legacy. But it was his son, Anthony J. Drexel, who would transform the family from prosperous money changers into a true national power. Anthony, who took control of the firm in the 1860s, was a visionary, but a conservative visionary. He had inherited his father's prudence, but he aimed it at a much larger target. He saw that the future of America was not in currency exchange, but in industrial expansion. The nation, rebuilding after the Civil War, was laying thousands of miles of railroad track, building steel mills, and digging mines. And these massive projects required a new, unheard-of level of capital. Drexel and Company was perfectly positioned. It had a massive surplus of capital from its safe, fee-based business. It had an impeccable reputation, and it had deep, trusted connections in Europe, the primary source of investment capital for the developing United States. Anthony Drexel began to pivot the firm. He transformed it from a money-changing service into a powerful investment bank. He began underwriting and selling U.S. government bonds to his European clients, helping to finance the post-Civil War reconstruction. He then moved into the massive, lucrative, and deeply corrupt world of railroad financing. But this was a world dominated by robber barons and unscrupulous speculators. Anthony Drexel, the conservative Philadelphian, needed a partner in New York, the new cutthroat center of American finance. He needed an enforcer, a man with a reputation for ruthless integrity and a direct line to the world's biggest investors. He found him in Junius Spencer Morgan and, more importantly, in his son, John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan. In 1871, Anthony J. Drexel and J.P. Morgan formed one of the most powerful alliances in financial history, Drexel, Morgan, and Co. This was the partnership that would finance the Gilded Age Drexel based in Philadelphia, provided the old money reputation, the deep capital base, and the conservative ballast. Morgan, based in New York, provided the ferocious energy, the iron will, and the direct personal connections to the European banking syndicates in London and Paris. Together, they were an unstoppable force. They became the U.S. government's primary bank, managing its bond issues. When the government's gold reserves were threatened during the Panic of 1893, it was not the U.S. Treasury that saved the country from default. It was a private syndicate led by J.P. Morgan and the Drexel firm. They gathered $62 million in gold, $2.5 billion today, and personally loaned it to the U.S. government, stabilizing the entire financial system. Their darker side, however, was in the railroad business. The 1870s were the era of scandals like the Crédit Mobilier, where politicians were bribed with railroad stock to approve fraudulent, taxpayer-funded contracts. While Drexel, Morgan, and Company was not directly implicated in these specific crimes, they were the primary beneficiaries of this corrupt system. They were the respectable face, the ones who cleaned the money. Their process, later known as Morganization, was a form of monopoly creation. They would identify railroad companies that were over-leveraged and on the brink of collapse, often due to the very corruption they had engaged in. Morgan and Drexel would then step in, force the company into receivership, wipe out the original shareholders, and reorganize it. They would consolidate competing lines/costs and install their own hand-picked Drexel or Morgan men on the board of directors. They were not just financing the railroads, they were taking control of them. This process, while bringing order to a chaotic industry, also concentrated an immense unaccountable power in the hands of their two firms. They, in effect, became the private, unelected board of directors for the entire American industrial economy. By the time Anthony J. Drexel died in 1893, he was one of the richest men in America, with a personal fortune of $50 million, billions today. The Drexel name was synonymous with the absolute peak of old money power, conservative, unassailable, and deeply intertwined with the U.S. government. His final act cemented this legacy. He was not a robber baron who hoarded his wealth. He was a Philadelphia patrician. In 1891, he founded the Drexel Institute of Art, Science, and Industry, now Drexel University. He endowed it with $3 million, a colossal sum, with a specific progressive mission. It was to be a technical, vocational school open to both men and women of all races to provide the working classes of Philadelphia with the skills needed for the new industrial age. This was the Drexel legacy. The family had successfully laundered its immigrant origins. It had transformed itself in just 2 generations from a painter's side hustle into the most respected philanthropic and powerful old money banking dynasty in America, the trusted partners of J.P. Morgan and the U.S. government. The firm, which eventually reverted to Drexel and Company after its formal partnership with Morgan, ended, though the families remained deeply allied, continued this gentlemanly tradition for the next 80 years. It was a white shoe firm, a quiet, respectable place that managed old fortunes and underwrote safe municipal bonds. By the 1970s, Drexel and Company was, in the words of Wall Street, dead. It was a sleepy, third-tier, old-name bank, completely eclipsed by the new bulge bracket giants like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. It was a prestigious, unprofitable relic. In 1973, in a desperate bid for survival, the firm, now known as Drexel Firestone, agreed to a merger of equals with Burnham and Company Burnham, and Company was the polar opposite of Drexel. It was a new money firm, an aggressive, Jewish-led trading house, and it was seen by the white shoe establishment as an outsider firm. The merger created Drexel Burnham. And in 1973, with that merger, the new firm absorbed a small, obscure, high-yield bond trading desk. And on that desk sat a brilliant, ambitious 27-year-old analyst from Wharton, a man who, like Francis Martin Drexel, was a new money outsider who saw an opportunity no one else did. His name was Michael Milken. The Drexel dynasty, the old money legacy of Francis and Anthony, was about to be hijacked. Its respectable name, which had been built over 130 years, was about to be attached to a new, revolutionary, and deeply corrupt financial weapon, the junk bond. The second and final act of the Drexel story was about to begin. The 1973 merger that created Drexel Burnham Lambert was, on paper, a desperate move by 2 second-tier firms. To survive, the old money Drexel name was fused with the new money trading aggression of Burnham and Company. But this merger was, in reality, a historical accident. It was a Trojan horse. The new firm had unknowingly swallowed the seed of a revolution, a man who would, in less than a decade, grow to become the most powerful and feared financier on earth, and who would ultimately burn the 152-year-old Drexel name to the ground. That man was Michael Milken. Milken was the ultimate outsider, the perfect predator for the Wall Street establishment. He was not a white shoe, Ivy League aristocrat. He was the son of a middle-class California accountant. He was Jewish in an era when the executive suites of old money banks like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs were still a fortress of white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege. He was an intense, awkward, and obsessive academic, a graduate of Berkeley and the Wharton School. And he was driven by a single powerful and, at the time, heretical idea. This idea, which he had developed in his thesis at Wharton, was simple. Wall Street was stupid. The entire old money financial world, the world of J.P. Morgan and the old Drexel partners, was built on a simple elitist principle. They only loaned money to investment-grade companies. These were the blue-chip giants, the old, stable, massive corporations like AT&T, General Motors, and RJR Nabisco. Any company that was not in this exclusive club, a new high-growth startup, a company in a risky new industry like cable television, or an old company that had temporarily fallen on hard times, a fallen angel, was locked out. Their bonds were rated as non-investment grade. The gentlemen of Wall Street, in their arrogance, had a single dismissive name for this entire massive market: junk. Michael Milken, the obsessive academic, had actually run the numbers. He had studied decades of bond market history, and he had discovered the great revolutionary secret that would make him a billionaire. Junk was mispriced. He proved that, statistically, the high interest rates paid by these junk bonds more than compensated for their slightly higher risk of default. He proved that a diversified portfolio of these junk bonds was actually a safer and far more profitable investment than the blue-chip bonds the establishment loved. The old money banks saw risk. Milken saw high yield. He joined Drexel in 1969 as a 23-year-old analyst in the sleepy, low-profit, high-yield bond department. When Drexel merged with Burnham, Milken, now his department's star, made a demand that would change history. He did not want to be in New York. He hated the Wall Street culture of who you know, of long lunches and Ivy League connections. He was a pure meritocratic numbers man. In 1978, he convinced the Drexel leadership to let him move his entire high-yield operation across the country to Beverly Hills, California. This was not a move. It was a secession. He was building his own separate financial kingdom, 3,000 miles away from the regulations, the oversight, and the white shoe culture of the New York headquarters. He created the X-shaped trading desk, a massive open room where he sat in the center, a general commanding an army of hundreds of young, hungry, and fiercely loyal traders who, like him, were outsiders dedicated to his new religion. From this Beverly Hills bunker, Michael Milken did not just trade junk bonds, he created the modern market. His strategy was a masterpiece of vertical integration. First, he built a private network of investors. He reached out to the new money players who were also locked out of the Wall Street establishment, insurance companies, savings and loans, and most famously, a new breed of ambitious corporate raiders like T. Boone Pickens, Carl E. Kahn, Ronald Perelman, and Steve Wynn. Second, he began to underwrite new junk bonds. This was the revolution. Before Milken, junk was just the debt of fallen companies. Milken began to use junk bonds to raise new money for companies the establishment wouldn't touch. Did Steve Wynn need $100 million to build a casino in Atlantic City? Goldman Sachs, who saw gambling as immoral and risky, would laugh him out of the room. Milken would raise the money in an afternoon. Did Ted Turner need $500 million to build a 24-hour cable news network? The old money bank saw it as a joke. Milken saw the future. He funded the unfundable, and in doing so, he financed the entire next generation of American capitalism. Third, and most critically, Milken made the market. He was not just the underwriter. He was the trader. His desk in Beverly Hills was the only place you could buy or sell these bonds. This gave him absolute, total, and monopolistic control. He controlled the supply by underwriting the deals, and he controlled the demand through his private network of buyers. He could set the price. He could move markets. He was the market. His power was absolute. He and his small team in Beverly Hills were generating over 40% of Drexel Burnham Lambert's entire profit. He was not just an employee, he was the firm's owner in all but name. He paid himself accordingly. In the mid-1980s, his personal compensation was not in the millions. It was in the hundreds of millions. In 1987 alone, his salary and bonus totaled $550 million for a single year. But this machine was not just for building companies. Milken soon realized it could be used as a weapon. The old money CEOs of America's blue-chip corporations, the men who ran companies like Gulf Oil, Revlon, and RJR Nabisco, had long been untouchable. They were protected by their allies at white shoe banks like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. No one had enough cash to buy them. Milken had just invented a way to create instant cash. He realized he could use his junk bond network not just to fund a new casino, but to fund a hostile takeover. A corporate raider like T. Boone Pickens could now target a company 10 times his size like Gulf Oil. Pickens would launch his raid, and Milken would, in a single day, raise the billions of dollars in junk bond debt necessary to buy the company. This was the leverage buyout, LBO. The raider would leverage the takeover, using the assets of the target company itself as collateral for the junk bonds Milken had just raised. It was a financial smart bomb, and it terrified the American establishment. The Drexel dynasty, the old conservative partner of J.P. Morgan, was now the banker for the barbarians at the Gate. Milken hosted a legendary annual conference in Beverly Hills, known simply as the Predators Ball. It was a gathering of his private cult, his junk bond-funded CEOs on one side, and his junk bond-funded investors, the Raiders, on the other. It was, as one attendee described it, a room full of hyenas, and Michael Milken was the zookeeper. This was the peak of the Drexel Empire. The market for high-yield bonds, which had been a sleepy $10 billion backwater when Milken started, had exploded into a $100 billion plus monster by 1986, and Drexel, from its Beverly Hills bunker, controlled nearly 80% of it. This financial revolution was perfectly in sync with the political revolution happening in Washington. The Reagan administration, with its gospel of deregulation and free market capitalism, saw Milken not as a threat, but as a hero. Milken was the man democratizing capital, breaking the grip of the lazy, old money establishment, and unleashing a new dynamic era of corporate efficiency. Milken, in turn, was a major political donor, helping to fund the very politicians who were deregulating his industry. But the machine was moving too fast, and it was built on a foundation of secrecy and conflicts of interest. Milken was not just the market maker, he was the insider. He knew which company was about to be raided before anyone else did, because he was the one funding the raid. This gave his trading desk an unassailable and deeply illegal advantage. The entire glittering $100 billion empire was built on a single toxic secret, an illicit informational partnership between Michael Milken, the junk bond king, and a man named Ivan Boesky. Boesky was an arbitrageur, a speculator who made billions by betting on which companies would be taken over. And as the government would soon discover, he had the best information in the world because he was allegedly getting it directly from Milken's network. In 1986, the first crack appeared. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, led by its enforcement chief Gary Lynch and the ambitious U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, Rudy Giuliani, were beginning to investigate a pattern of insider trading. They caught a minor banker who, to save himself, gave them a bigger name, Dennis Levine. Dennis Levine, a managing director at Drexel, was arrested for trading on inside information, And to save himself, he gave the government the biggest name they had ever heard. He gave them Ivan Boesky. In November 1986, the financial world was shaken to its core. Ivan Boesky, the king of the arbitrageurs, was arrested. He pleaded guilty to insider trading, agreeing to pay a then-record $100 million fine. But that was not all. As part of his plea deal, Boesky, the ultimate insider, agreed to become the ultimate informant. He agreed to tell the government everything he knew, and there was only one man left in the world who was bigger than Ivan Boesky. The government, with Boesky as their guide, now had a direct, legal, and vengeful path to the X-shaped desk in Beverly Hills. They had a path to Michael Milken. The old money Drexel name, which had survived the Panic of 1893 and the Great Depression, was now tied to the largest criminal investigation in Wall Street history. The second act of the Drexel dynasty was about to come to a catastrophic and criminal end. The arrest of Ivan Boesky in November 1986 was the first tremor of an earthquake that would bring the entire Drexel dynasty crashing to the ground. Boesky, the king of the arbitrageurs, was the most visible and audacious speculator of his generation. And in a desperate bid to save himself from a life sentence, he had agreed to become a government informant. He had turned on his secret partner, his insider, the true source of his seemingly magical ability to predict takeovers. He gave the government Michael Milken. The investigation was led by a new breed of ambitious, media-savvy federal prosecutor in Manhattan, Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, saw the rampant greed of the 1980s not just as a series of individual crimes, but as a systemic corruption of the market. He did not just want to fine a few bankers, he wanted to destroy the entire machine. And to do it, he deployed the most powerful and terrifying weapon in the federal arsenal, the RICO Act. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was a law designed in 1970 to fight the mafia. It allowed prosecutors to try organizations, not just individuals, as a criminal enterprise. If convicted, the government had the power to seize all of the enterprise's assets. Giuliani's brilliant and terrifying legal innovation was to apply this law, for the first time, to a major Wall Street investment bank. His target was Drexel Burnham Lambert. His thesis was simple. Drexel's Beverly Hills junk bond operation, led by Michael Milken, was not a legitimate bank that had a few rogue employees. It was a criminal enterprise in its entirety, an organization whose entire business model was a massive, ongoing criminal conspiracy to defraud the public. For 2 years, Giuliani and the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, built their case, fueled by the secret recordings and testimony of Boesky and a growing list of other traders who had flipped. They painstakingly reverse-engineered the magic of the Milken machine. And what they found was not genius. It was a vast, complex, and brazen criminal conspiracy. The Den of Thieves, as the journalist James B. Stewart would later title his definitive book, was built on several illegal pillars. The first and simplest was insider trading. It was a direct quid pro quo relationship. Milken's desk, which was originating the junk bonds to fund a secret corporate raid, would allegedly tip off Ivan Boesky before the raid was announced. Boesky, armed with this perfect non-public information, would buy millions of shares of the target stock. The stock would, of course, soar when the takeover bid became public, and Boesky would make a risk-free fortune, a portion of which he would allegedly kick back to Milken. The second crime was market manipulation. Milken, from his X-shaped desk, was the junk bond market. He controlled it. He allegedly used this power to pump the price of his own bonds. He would force his vast network of investors, the Predators Ball attendees, who depended on him for their next deal, to buy a new, risky junk bond issue. This created a massive artificial demand, making the bond look like a success. This was reinforced by bribery. To create this artificial market, Milken's team allegedly offered illegal kickbacks to the managers of pension funds and mutual funds. They would, for example, have Drexel buy a different, unrelated block of stock from a fund manager at an inflated price, a sweetheart deal. In exchange, that fund manager would use his pensioners' money to buy Milken's new high-risk junk bonds. The third crime was a scheme known as parking. This was a conspiracy to hide Milken's own illegal stock ownership. Boesky would buy millions in stock, but he would be buying it for Milken. He would park it in his own accounts, hiding Milken's name from the SEC. This was done to illegally bypass the 5% ownership disclosure laws, which were designed to alert the public to a potential takeover. This entire criminal ecosystem was managed from the Beverly Hills bunker. It was a cult of personality, built on a fanatical loyalty to Michael Milken. It was a macho, high-pressure trading floor that excluded women and minorities, a place where traders, who were making millions in bonuses, were driven by one creed: greed is good. This was the real-life inspiration for Gordon Gekko, the villain of the 1987 film Wall Street. The government, armed with this evidence, finally struck. In September 1988, the SEC filed a massive 184-page civil complaint against Drexel, Milken, and his top lieutenants, alleging a massive fraudulent scheme. The walls were closing in, but the kill shot came from Giuliani. He threatened the Drexel board with his ultimate weapon, a RICO indictment against the entire firm. This was a corporate death sentence. A RICO indictment would allow the government to freeze all of the firm's assets before a trial even began. For a Wall Street bank which survives day to day on the confidence of its lenders, this was a run-on-the-bank scenario. The firm would be dead in 24 hours. The Drexel board in New York, led by CEO Fred Joseph, was now in a desperate, impossible position. They were the descendants of the old money Drexel dynasty, the partners of J.P. Morgan, and they were being threatened with being legally declared a mafia family. Milken, the outsider in Beverly Hills, had become a cancerous growth that was about to kill the entire host. Milken, the fighter, wanted to fight the charges. He believed he could win. But the White Shoe New York board, terrified of RICO, mutinied. In December 1988, in one of the most stunning surrenders in financial history, the board of Drexel Burnham Lambert, to save the firm from a RICO indictment, agreed to plead guilty to 6 felony counts of securities and mail fraud. They agreed to pay a staggering, record-shattering fine of $650 million. This was the moment the 152-year-old dynasty died. The firm, founded by the scrupulous Francis Martin Drexel, had just publicly admitted that it was a criminal enterprise. The cost of this plea was more than just money. As part of the deal, Drexel agreed to cooperate with the government's ongoing investigation against Michael Milken. The firm that Milken had built, the firm that he had made billions for, had just turned on him. They fired him. They publicly announced that his 1988 bonus would be withheld. Michael Milken, the junk bond king, was now alone, a pariah, with the entire weight of the U.S. government and his own former company bearing down on him. In March 1989, Giuliani, armed with the firm's cooperation, unveiled his masterpiece, a 98-count RICO indictment against Michael Milken personally. The charges range from racketeering and insider trading to fraud and stock manipulation. The effect was instantaneous. The junk bond market, which was Michael Milken, froze and then collapsed. Without Milken at the center of the X desk, without his force of will to guarantee the trades and make the market, the magic was gone. The predator's ball was over. Investors, terrified, stampeded for the exits. The value of junk bonds evaporated. And this led to the final fatal irony. Drexel Burnham Lambert, the firm, had sold its soul to survive, but the firm's entire business model was Michael Milken. With Milken gone and the junk bond market he created now dead, Drexel had no business left. The $650 million fine was a grievous wound, but the loss of Milken was the kill shot. The firm began to hemorrhage money, posting a $1 billion loss it needed to roll over its own short-term commercial debt to survive. But now, it was a convicted felon. The other banks on Wall Street, the old money firms like J.P. Morgan, the original partners of the Drexel family, refused to extend credit. They had been waiting decades for this moment, and they cut the firm's throat. On February 13, 1990, Drexel Burnham Lambert, the most powerful and profitable bank of the 1980s, facing a liquidity crisis it could not meet, officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The collapse was total. 5,000 employees lost their jobs. The 152-year-old Drexel name, a name that had once saved the U.S. government from default, was now worthless, a symbol of the greatest financial scandal of the 20th century. 2 months later, in April 1990, Michael Milken, alone and facing a potential life sentence under the RICO charges, struck his own deal. He pleaded guilty to 6 felonies, lesser charges of securities, fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a sentence later reduced to 2 for good behavior and his cooperation in other cases. He was fined $600 million. The public reaction was one of pure, cathartic relief. Michael Milken, the junk bond king, had become the real-life Gordon Gekko. He was the face of a decade of decadent, unapologetic greed. His downfall, along with the collapse of the savings and loan industry, which his junk bonds had helped destroy, was seen as the end of an era. The scandal permanently changed Wall Street. It led directly to new, tougher laws like the Insider Trading and Securities Fraud Enforcement Act of 1988, and it led to new international banking regulations like the Basel Accords, which forced banks to hold more capital against their risky assets. The dynasty founded by Francis Martin Drexel was dead, destroyed by an outsider who had hijacked its name. But the old money legacy of the family would, in a final ironic twist, outlive the new money empire that had consumed it. The $650 million fine and the guilty plea to 6 felonies in 1988 was the death warrant for the 152-year-old Drexel dynasty. It was a public admission of what prosecutors had alleged. The firm was not just a bank, but a criminal enterprise. But the collapse and the plea were just the finale. The true story, the story that the SEC and Rudy Giuliani's office had painstakingly pieced together, was of a complex, brilliant, and deeply corrupt machine that had been running for over a decade. This was not a story of a few rogue traders. It was a story of a systemic, institutionalized abuse of power, orchestrated from the top down by Michael Milken, a man who had not just hijacked the Drexel name, but had transformed it into the most powerful criminal syndicate in American financial history. This was the governance scandal, and at its heart, it was a total absence of governance. The old money Drexel board in New York, the descendants of Anthony J. Drexel's conservative white shoe culture, had, in their desperation for profits, handed the keys to the kingdom to a man they did not understand, and, in the end, could not control Milken, operating from his Beverly Hills bunker, 3,000 miles away from headquarters, had built a firm within a firm, a cult-like operation with its own rules, its own loyalties, and its own secret, illegal mechanisms for generating profit. The true story of this machine was later chronicled in the definitive best-selling book Den of Thieves by journalist James B. Stewart. Stewart, using thousands of pages of secret grand jury testimony, internal memos, and interviews, laid bare the three great scandals that Milken had perfected. These were not just isolated lapses. They were the engine of his junk bond revolution. The first and most famous mechanism was insider trading. This was the core of the illicit partnership between Michael Milken and the king of the arbitrageurs, Ivan Boesky. It was a simple, illegal, and obscenely profitable information loop. It worked like this. Milken's desk in Beverly Hills was the originator of the junk bond debt used to finance almost every major hostile takeover of the 1980s. This meant that Michael Milken knew, before anyone else in the world, which company was about to be put in play. Before a corporate raider like Carl Icahn or Ronald Perlman could launch his surprise hostile bid, he first had to know he could get the financing. He would secretly go to Milken. Milken, and only Milken, could in a single day raise the billions of dollars in junk bonds necessary for the attack. This secret that, for example, Perlman was about to launch a hostile bid for Revlon was the single most valuable piece of information on Wall Street. According to the government's case, Milken would then illegally tip off his preferred client, Ivan Boesky. Boesky, armed with this perfect non-public information, would then use his own massive funds to buy millions of shares of the target company's stock before the bid was made. Public days, or sometimes just hours later, the raider would announce his surprise bid. The target company's stock would naturally explode in value. Ivan Boesky would then sell his shares, making a massive, instantaneous, and completely risk-free profit of tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. This was not smart investing. It was simple, blatant theft. But the conspiracy did not end there. Boesky's profits had to be shared with the man who had provided the information. Milken could not just take a cash bribe. The kickback mechanism was itself another, more sophisticated crime. Boesky would pay Milken back through a series of fraudulent, prearranged trades. Boesky's firm, for example, would sell a block of stock or bonds to a secret offshore shell company, or a parking account controlled by Milken's team, at a fake, artificially low price. Milken's account would then immediately sell that same stock at its real, higher market price, booking a profit. This profit was, in reality, Boesky's kickback, a laundered payment for the inside information. The government's case was built on tracing this complex, dirty money trail, a trail that Boesky, as their star informant, had laid out for them like a roadmap. This led to the second and more complex abuse of power, a scheme known as stock parking. Parking was a tool of mass deception, and it was Milken's primary weapon for manipulating the market. It was a criminal conspiracy, pure and simple. It worked in two ways. First, it was used to hide illegal ownership. SEC law, then and now, required any investor who acquired 5% of a company's stock to publicly disclose that fact. This 5% rule was the tripwire for hostile takeovers. It was designed to warn a target company and the public that a raid was in progress. Milken's raiders wanted to operate in secret. They needed to acquire more than 5% without alerting the target. So Milken would allegedly use his network. His raider client might buy 4.9%. Then Ivan Boesky would buy 4.9%. Another Milken-controlled fund would buy 4.9%. But according to the government, Boesky and the other funds were secretly parking that stock for the raider. They had a secret, illegal agreement to sell that stock to the raider or vote with him when the time was right. This conspiracy allowed Milken's clients to secretly control 10, 15, or 20% of a company, all while appearing to be in compliance with the law. It was a lie, and it allowed them to launch their surprise attacks with a massive illegal advantage. The second use of parking was even more corrupt. It was used to manipulate Drexel's own books and to bribe other institutions. If Milken's junk bond desk was stuck with a bad investment that was losing money, they couldn't just show that loss on their quarterly reports. It would hurt their profits and their bonuses. So, just before the end of the quarter, Milken would sell that losing bond to Ivan Boesky. Boesky would buy it, parking it in his own accounts, taking the loss off of Drexel's books. Drexel would then report a beautiful, profitable quarter. Then after the quarter ended, Boesky would, per their secret agreement, sell the bond back to Drexel, often at a small prearranged profit for his trouble. The loss was still there, but it had been illegally hidden from the public, from shareholders, and from regulators. This led to the third and perhaps most systemic abuse, the bribery of institutional clients. Milken's junk bond machine was not just a trading desk, it was a placement machine. He was underwriting billions of dollars in new, high-risk, unrated bonds. He had to find buyers for this mountain of junk. His primary targets were the managers of pension funds, savings and loans, and mutual funds. These managers were fiduciaries, responsible for protecting the safe retirement and savings money of ordinary Americans. They were legally and morally prohibited from gambling that money on high-risk junk. Milken's task was to persuade them to do it anyway. And he did it through a sophisticated and deeply corrupt system of bribery. This was not a briefcase full of cash. It was a quid pro quo system of favors. If a pension fund manager in California agreed to forget his fiduciary duty and use his pensioners' money to buy $100 million of Milken's new risky bonds, Milken's desk would, in return, do that manager a favor. These favors were themselves often illegal trades. For example, Milken's desk might sell that same fund manager a block of highly coveted hot stock from a different company's IPO, guaranteeing him an instant personal profit. Or they would use the parking scheme in reverse. They would buy a block of bad stock from the fund manager's portfolio at an artificially high price, taking a loss for Drexel, but handing the fund manager a win that made him look like a genius to his own board. This network of corruption was the true magic of the Predator's Ball, Milken's legendary annual conference in Beverly Hills. It was not just a conference, it was a gathering of the co-conspirators. It was the one place where all the pieces of the machine came together, the corporate raiders, like Icahn and Pickens, who needed the money, the fund managers, the marks, who would be bribed to buy the junk, and Milken, the zookeeper at the center, who brokered the deals and took his cut from everyone. This entire criminal enterprise was protected by the culture of the Beverly Hills office. This was the final and most profound governance scandal. The New York board, led by Fred Joseph, had zero control. The Beverly Hills office was, for all intents and purposes, a separate company. It was a cult, built on total fanatical loyalty to Michael Milken. This was the infamous macho trading floor culture of the 1980s. It was a room of young, hungry, mostly male, and almost all white traders, many of whom, like Milken, were Jewish and saw themselves as outsiders storming the WASP citadels of Wall Street. They worked 20-hour days, fueled by adrenaline and allegedly cocaine. They screamed at each other across the X-shaped desk, ate greasy food at their terminals, and lived in a bubble of their own perceived invincibility. This culture was, as later studies from Harvard Business Review would note, systemically abusive. It was famously hostile to women and minorities, who were largely relegated to administrative, non-power positions. The trading floor humor was infamously crude, sexist, and racist, but this culture served a key purpose. It enforced loyalty and secrecy. No one would question Michael. He was the man making them all millionaires overnight. His word was law. This cult-like devotion, this frat house mentality, was the perfect incubator for systemic crime because it actively rejected any outsider, like a New York auditor or an SEC regulator, who dared to ask questions. This was the den of thieves that Giuliani and the SEC finally brought to light. The $650 million fine that Drexel, the firm, agreed to pay in 1988 was the price for all of this. For the insider trading, for the parking, for the bribery, for the market manipulation, and the $600 million fine that Milken personally paid in 1990 was his share. The collapse of the firm was the inevitable result. The moment the government exposed the mechanics of the fraud, the magic was gone. No one would trust Drexel again. No one would buy Milken's bonds. The entire multi-billion-dollar empire, which had been presented as a brilliant free market innovation, was revealed to be a simple, old-fashioned criminal racket. The old money Drexel dynasty, founded by Francis and Anthony, was built on the rock of trust. The new money dynasty built by Milken was built on the sand of criminal conspiracy. When the tide of the law finally came in, the entire glittering 152-year-old edifice was washed away, as if it had never been there at all. The 1990 collapse was more than a corporate bankruptcy. It was the final bloody battle in a civil war that had raged within Drexel for a decade. The Drexel dynasty was, in fact, two warring families under one roof. The Old Money New York Board, led by CEO Fred Joseph, and Michael Milken's new money cult in Beverly Hills. The government's RICO indictment didn't cause the firm's death. It merely exposed this fatal internal rot. It forced the New York family to do the unthinkable. To save themselves, they had to execute their Californian brother. This act of familial betrayal was the end of the dynasty. But the personal tragedies were just beginning, unfolding in a cascade of ruin that consumed every single person involved. The disintegration of the Drexel family was immediate and brutal. The 5,000 employees, from millionaire bankers in New York to secretaries in Beverly Hills, showed up to work to find the doors chained. They were told the firm was dead. Their careers were over. Worse, many of them had their entire net worth, their life savings, tied up in the firm's now worthless stock. They had been loyal to the family, and the family had imploded, wiping them out. The next tragic figure was Fred Joseph, the CEO. He was the old money king who had lost his kingdom. He was, in many ways, the ultimate fall guy. He was not the criminal mastermind, but he was the incompetent enabler. He was the man who had lost control. His personal reputation was destroyed. He was barred from the industry. He became the symbol of the failed white shoe New York management that had been asleep at the wheel, a man whose name would forever be synonymous with the greatest failure of governance in Wall Street history. The criminal enterprise in Beverly Hills was, at its heart, a family business. Milken's right-hand man, his chief legal and financial architect, the man who had allegedly structured the most complex and fraudulent of their parking partnerships, was his own brother, Lowell Milken. When Giuliani unveiled his 98-count RICO indictment, it was not just against Michael. It was against Michael and Lowell. The government had them both. This set the stage for the final personal drama. Michael Milken, the king, was facing a life sentence, but the government, it was clear, was using his brother Lowell as a hostage. Their real target was Michael. For months, Michael, the fighter, insisted he was innocent. He was a visionary, not a criminal. He believed he could fight the charges in court and win, but he could not, in the end, risk his family. In April 1990, in a packed Manhattan courtroom, Michael Milken finally surrendered. He agreed to a plea deal. He is, in the end, the ultimate robber baron, a man who proved that if you steal enough and then give enough back, you can, in the end, buy your own redemption. The man who had been defined by his 6 felonies had, in his final act, successfully re-leveraged his entire life, using his money to buy back the one asset that had seemed forever lost, his own name. The 1990 bankruptcy of Drexel Burnham Lambert was not just a corporate failure, it was a cultural exorcism. The 1980s, the decade of greed, had died, and the public needed a body to bury the firm, and its messianic leader, Michael Milken, were the perfect sacrifice. The junk bond king was in prison. His $600 million fine was paid, and his 152-year-old bank was a memory, its 5,000 employees scattered to the winds. But the story, like the Drexel name itself, was far too complex to be buried. The official narrative that a den of thieves led by Milken had run a massive criminal enterprise was satisfying, but to many it felt incomplete. The scale of the collapse, the web of powerful players, and the sheer revolutionary nature of what Milken had built left a vacuum that was quickly filled with conspiracy theories, enduring myths, and a bitter, decades-long debate over the dynasty's true legacy. This final chapter is not just about the firm's death. It is about the ghosts it left behind. It is a story that pits the conspiracy theories of a criminal cabal against the reality of a financial revolution and ends with the ultimate question. Was Michael Milken a con man who destroyed a 150-year-old family, or was he a visionary, and the family named just the junk he used to build his own, more enduring empire? The darkest and most persistent conspiracy theories surrounding the Drexel collapse were not that Milken was guilty, but that he was framed. This narrative, which Milken himself and his most ardent supporters would quietly cultivate for decades, was that his prosecution was not a righteous act of justice, it was a political assassination. This theory posits that Michael Milken's true crime was not insider trading or market manipulation. His true crime was success. He was the outsider, a Jewish upstart from California, who had built a machine that threatened the very foundations of the old money, WASP-controlled Wall Street establishment, the white shoe firms, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and J.P. Morgan, the original Drexel partner, had a cozy monopoly on American finance. They decided which companies got built and which CEOs got fired. Milken's junk bond revolution was a declaration of war on this club. He had created a parallel financial system, a new source of capital that was democratic, meritocratic, and completely outside their control. He had financed a new generation of new money titans, Ted Turner, CNN, Steve Wynn, casinos, Craig McCaw, cell phones, Bill McGowan, MCI, men the old guard had dismissed as unfundable. Worse, he had given his barbarians the weapon, the leveraged buyout LBO, to attack the establishment's most sacred clients. The CEOs of Blue Chip America were, for the first time, terrified of losing their jobs. According to this theory, the establishment decided that Milken had to be destroyed. They couldn't beat him in the market, so they would beat him in the courts. They allegedly weaponized the SEC and Rudy Giuliani's ambitious U.S. Attorney's Office, feeding them information, pressuring them to act, and demanding a kill shot. The goal was not to clean up Wall Street. It was to eliminate the competition. The RICO indictment in this view was the smoking gun. It was a mafia law, a wildly inappropriate and disproportionate weapon used to guarantee Drexel's destruction before a single piece of evidence was ever presented in court. It was, as Milken's defenders and later President Trump in his pardon statement would claim, an act of prosecutorial overreach. This theory was bolstered by another, even darker, whisper. This was the conspiracy that James B. Stewart's Den of Thieves had hinted at, but never fully proven, that the Drexel operation was not just a financial cabal, but was also connected to the mafia. The rumors alleged that Milken's vast opaque network of junk bond-funded savings and loans, S&Ls, was a perfect vehicle for laundering organized crime money. While no hard evidence of a direct link between Milken and the mafia was ever presented, the racketeering, RICO, charge itself, and the shady, bust-out nature of some of his S&L clients forever linked the Drexel collapse to the criminal underworld in the public's imagination. But the reality of Drexel's global influence is far more complex and far more profound than any of these conspiracies. The truth is that Milken's innovations, both legal and illegal, did permanently change the world he was, in fact, the revolutionary he claimed to be. His first and most important real legacy was the democratization of capital. Before Milken, the American economy was a rigid, two-tiered system. If you were a blue-chip company, you had access to cheap, endless capital from the old money banks. If you were anyone else, you had nothing. Milken's high-yield junk bonds blew this system apart. For the first time, a small, innovative startup or a medium-sized family company could raise the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars needed to compete with the giants. Milken's junk bonds funded the entire telecommunications revolution. They funded MCI Communications, the company that broke AT&T's government-protected monopoly on long-distance calls. They funded McCaw Cellular, which built the foundation of the entire U.S. cell phone network. They funded Ted Turner's CNN, a 24-hour news network that the establishment had laughed at. Milken's defenders argue that every single American who has a cell phone, who watches cable news, or who has benefited from the lower prices that come from corporate competition owes a direct debt to the financial revolution. He started his second and more controversial legacy was the leveraged buyout, LBO. To the old money establishment, this was a destructive, parasitic, strip-and-flip operation. Milken's raiders were barbarians, buying healthy companies with debt, firing thousands of workers, asset stripping the valuable divisions, and then selling the hollowed-out carcass for a quick profit. But to Milken and his free market disciples, the LBO was a virtuous tool. It was the Darwinian mechanism for corporate efficiency. They argued that the blue-chip CEOs of the 1970s and 80s were lazy, complacent, and incompetent. They had grown fat and inefficient, protected by their white shoe bankers. The threat of a Milken-funded LBO, they argued, was the only thing that could force these lazy CEOs to wake up. It forced them to slim down, to sell off unprofitable divisions, to innovate, and to maximize shareholder value. Milken, in this view, was not a raider. He was a corporate disciplinarian, a force of creative destruction that made the entire American economy more competitive and efficient. The 1988 RJR Nabisco deal, the largest LBO in history, chronicled in the book and film Barbarians at the Gate, became the ultimate symbol of this new, brutal, but highly efficient form of capitalism. This was the real soft power of the Drexel dynasty's second act. It was not a conspiracy. It was a full-frontal assault on the old way of doing business. The final verdict on the Drexel dynasty, then, is a story of two competing legacies, both of which are true. The first dynasty, the bloodline of Francis Martin and Anthony J. Drexel, left a quiet, respectable, and enduring legacy. It is the legacy of Drexel University, a massive $700 million a year educational institution dedicated to the founder's practical, working-class vision. It is the legacy of a gentlemanly bank that for a century helped build the American government and its industrial infrastructure. It is a legacy of old money stability and civic-minded philanthropy. The second dynasty, the financial cult of Michael Milken, left a legacy of chaos, criminality, and revolution. The rebuttal to the den of thieves narrative is Milken's own third act. His pardon by President Trump in 2020 was the final formal attempt to rewrite this history. It was the culmination of a 30-year, multi-billion-dollar public relations campaign. Milken's defenders, a powerful group that includes the world's top CEOs, scientists, and politicians, argue that his 6 felonies were minor technical infractions, the product of an overzealous, politically motivated prosecution. They argue that his true legacy is not his prison sentence, but his philanthropy. His prostate cancer foundation has, by all accounts, revolutionized medical research. He applied his junk bond model to science, breaking down the slow, bureaucratic silos of academia, forcing collaboration, and securitizing research to get cures to market faster. His supporters, many of whom are alive today because of the treatments he funded, argue that this act alone outweighs the financial sins of the 1980s. His Milken Institute has successfully replaced the Predators Ball with the Davos West, a legitimate global forum for solving the world's greatest problems. But the critics, including the 5,000 employees who lost their jobs, the pensioners of the S&Ls that his junk bonds helped destroy, and the U.S. taxpayers who had to foot the bill for the S&L bailout, a crisis that cost the country nearly $150 billion, have a different view. They argue that Milken's philanthropy is not redemption. It is a reputation laundering scheme. They argue that it is the ultimate Drexel transaction, a way to use a fraction of his ill-gotten, multi-billion-dollar fortune to buy his way back into the very establishment he once claimed to despise. They see the 2020 pardon not as justice, but as the final cynical proof that in America, if you are wealthy and powerful enough, insider trading of a different kind, trading political donations for a pardon, can erase any crime. The Drexel story is the ultimate lesson in 20th century American power. The original, respectable Drexel family built their fortune on the rock of trust, only to see their dynasty fade into obscurity and incompetence. The second illegitimate Milken dynasty hijacked that name and built a new empire on the quicksand of fraud. In the end, the old money name, which had stood for 150 years of integrity, was destroyed overnight, and the new money criminal, Michael Milken, had, in a final brilliant and deeply cynical move, proven that his junk was, in fact, the more durable asset he had used his junk money to buy the one thing the old money family had lost and could never get back: a legacy.